If you're not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button now, along with the bell icon so you can be notified whenever a new video is posted. And if you're already subscribed, check and make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you. And of course, be sure to give the video a like as well as share it on your social media. The white supremacists hate that. And now, the Sunday address. Unless you've spent the last few weeks hiding under a rock or getting all your news from the old black media, then there's no way you could have avoided hearing about the story of the killing of UnitedHealth CEO Brian Thompson, who was shot dead in New York City on December 4th. The deliberate, targeted killing of a corporate CEO. This kind of thing practically never happens in the United States. And since this was a corporate CEO who got whacked in the very center of America's financial heart, naturally, there's going to be a lot of rich and powerful people who would want the killer found and quickly, because you got to send a message with this kind of thing. So the white media and the police saturation bombed the public with this news in the hopes that somebody would come forward and they could find a suspect. But the only thing more shocking than the brazen killing of Brian Thompson was how the public reacted to this event. Not with surprise or sadness or even sympathy, but rather with satisfaction. As a number of people noted, Brian Thompson got more media coverage than his policyholders got medical coverage. That pretty much summed up public sentiment right there. The white media, which is owned by the wealthy and largely based out of New York, has been angered by this reaction, but how do they lecture their audiences not to take glee at this killing when they depend on that same audience for advertiser revenue? And they ignore the fact that the white media's value system, which comes from the wealthy and rich who own it, has for many decades now glorified cutthroat politics, backstabbing business, and doing whatever you want in the name of savage capitalism. So that being the case, if somebody gets hurt, you've conditioned the public to accept that because you got to accept it when the rich and powerful do it. And this public attitude has been completely predictable. With the catastrophic imbalance between rich and poor that the wealthy have engineered in this country, they have long been anticipating that at some juncture, this country would reach an inevitable breaking point, and things like this would well begin happening. The entire American economy has been turned into an out-and-out gigantic pyramid scheme, and it's impossible for the public not to notice who's at the top. All these corporate executives have been operating out of the same playbook. This is why prices get higher, but employee wages stay low. And for 3 decades it's been this way. And the quality of these companies' goods and services has only gone down. I won't use the term that's been used popularly to describe this process, but it's no accident that the quality of goods and services has become crap. More and more difficult to use, quality in the gutter, and the government has not reacted at all, even given public outrage. It's also why these executives are so easily able to bounce from one corporation to the other, even though they have no experience in the company that they're going to. Guys from a telecommunications company can bounce over to General Motors. Guys from the corporate white media can go work at a tech company. And guys from these hedge funds can go work anywhere because they believe in just firing everyone and selling off all the company's assets. For these corporations, the enemy isn't their business competitors. The enemy are the customers and their own employees. And nowhere is this corporate contempt for the public more evident than in the so-called healthcare field. So, as the rich and powerful see it, Brian Thompson is literally an avatar for them, and they certainly don't want to see what happened to him become habit-forming. So, in due time, they eventually were able to track down a suspect, one Luigi Mangione, who apparently was caught in a McDonald's after an employee there claimed to have spotted him. Naturally, he was taken in alive without so much as a hair out of place because he wasn't black. And now what we've seen is the inevitable perp walk. Can you believe it? All this security just for one guy's perp walk, a guy who they know has some spikes in his back, so he's not exactly nimble on his feet. Obviously, they did this in order to satiate the corrupt corporate types who this killing put the fear of God into. All of those corporate execs, especially the ones in New York City, they've been hiding under their beds, wondering if Mangione was coming for them next. And now they needed to see he was sitting here shackled up like King Kong with a ton of security around him to show the world we're all over this guy. Now, they could have just driven him straight to wherever he's to be confined at. They didn't have to bring him in by helicopter, but they wanted to do it this way. You got the NYPD there, FBI Joint Task Force, and speaking of the cops, naturally Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD was in tow, because of course he is. Now, can you think of any time in the history of New York City that a perpetrator was arrested and the mayor himself at any time in the city's history showed up? Hell, can you think of a time when any mayor of any city anywhere personally showed up just so he could be in tow for the photos when a suspect takes a perp walk? I certainly can't think of a single instance. but it happened this time. So when I tell you that this clown is Officer Eric Adams, when I call him that, I sure hope people understand that I mean it. I mean, for Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD to be there, to even be present for this, why was he even there? Am I supposed to believe that he somehow had anything to do with the capture of this suspect? And it was stupid of him to do this because of how ridiculously self-serving it clearly is. But I suppose when you're under investigation for crimes yourself, in Officer Adams' mind, he thinks he's given the white media something juicier than himself to chew on. What an idiot. All these high-profile Negroes never learn. White power would much rather have a black person to throw in jail than a white one. And white power knows how to take both sides of the conversation, as Neely Fuller said, so white power can have its cake and eat it too. It can throw this Luigi guy in prison and next toss Officer Eric Adams in the clink right beside him. In all likelihood, that's probably how things are going to shake out for Officer Eric Adams, because if the chances are that a mayor of New York City is going to wind up behind bars, well, for the white media, if a white former mayor like Rudy Giuliani is in danger of going to prison, they got to make sure to balance out the headlines by making a bigger deal about Officer Eric Adams going down. We've seen this white media tactic enough times by now to know that's how things are going to pan out. But the reason that I've decided to make this guy the subject of this evening's address is because we need to understand that the Schadenfreude support that this guy is getting is not unconditional, and the white media's contempt for him and chagrin at the public support for him does have its boundaries. Keep in mind, the similarities between Luigi Mangione and Brian Thompson actually outweigh the differences. Both of these guys come from families with money. Luigi Mangione's family is wealthy, as the white media describes them. And that being the case, while he may have had a legitimate bone to pick with UnitedHealth, the bone that he had to pick wasn't because of cost. He could afford whatever medical procedure it was that they may have been turning him or his loved ones down for. And part of the white media's job is to lionize and praise and canonize wealth, because that's part of how the American pecking order is structured. You got to make sure that the wealth is in the hands of people who are not black, and then you go ahead and praise it and lavish all of this laudatory accolades on it to make it clear to everybody, this is what you want to be, this is where you want to go, and these people can do no wrong, as long as they're not black. But for this Mangione character, he's getting the kudos and support of the public for a reason. Now, for black folks, we need to see this clearly. People tend to confuse disputed with controversial. Looking at the way the white media has been talking about this guy, and clearly there's a lot of contempt from the white powers that be, especially rich powers that be over this guy. Don't you go getting confused, because people tend to confuse dismay with opposition. And with black people, we willfully choose to confuse how the dominant society, especially its media, looks at black people if they do the same thing as those classified as white. And speaking of vigilante killings, there would be the inevitable comparisons between this killing and Daniel Penny. That creep supporters really can't stand up for, and they can't really defend him, so they get indignant when somebody mentions him in relation to this or other killings in New York City. But after all, if sneaking up behind someone and killing them is legal on the subway, then why shouldn't it be legal on Fifth Avenue? They all knew that this would be compared to the murder of Jordan Neely, so they've made this CEO's death into something less than the violent killing of Jordan Neely. But everybody knows exactly what it is. That's why the comparisons are made. You see, people from the dominant society who kill are heroes, or otherwise held up as being complicated cases that can't be simply called murder. Because there's always some sort of extenuating circumstances, usually their skin color, as long as the color isn't black. The white media is not demonizing Mangione either, by the way. They're not digging around in his past to see if there's anyone who'll say anything disparaging about him either. They understand that there's a very delicate tightrope that they have to walk in cases like this. Now, they're doing all this for a man who the rich and powerful are scared of, and who demanded heaven and earth be moved in order to locate him. So even when facing an internal crisis, white power understands not to treat one of its own the way that they treat black people. The racial double standard has to be maintained at all costs. And speaking of the racial double standard, there was a case just yesterday where a homeless woman in New York City was sleeping on a subway train when some reprobate set her on fire. Now, this woman was homeless, but you wouldn't know about how the white media reported on it. All of their headlines, in fact, the bodies of their story, they bent over backwards to avoid using the word homeless. Instead, the white media simply said a woman was sleeping on the subway, as if she was some overworked employee coming from the financial district or something. A woman sleeping on the subway. That's how they phrased it. They've never gone out of their way to lie by omission like this, by deliberately not reporting that the victim of a crime in a story about the homeless was homeless. Homeless people are the perpetual targets of violence in America. They get assaulted, set on fire, killed. Many of them get strangled by inbred pukes like Daniel Penny, and in all of those cases, the white media calls them homeless, as if that was their name. And yet, in this case, they're not mentioning that this woman's homeless at all. They're going out of their way to make sure they don't say that. They don't tell you anything about this woman. No name, no race, no anything. They don't give a mini bio about her, nothing. Kind of strange if she's just a woman sleeping on the subway, right? They ought to know something about her. But in this case, they don't. She's homeless. The white media already knows common sense is going to compel people to automatically draw a connection between this crime and Daniel Penny's heinous strangulation of Jordan Neely. We see the white media once again circling the wagons and coordinating a massive line of propaganda. This is not just a matter of they did this happenstance. The fact that all of them are doing the exact same thing, that means this is coordinated, just like the white media blackout on mentioning Daniel Penny's name. It is impossible to get this kind of across-the-board uniformity refusal to mention something without these guys talking to each other and saying, hey, everybody get on code. We're just not going to mention this. And yet, there's no one defending this latest killing that's taken place on the subway. The NYPD have put out statements. They want to catch this guy, and reports are that they have. But where's Officer Eric Adams at to talk about how dangerous homeless people are on the trains now? I guess he was too busy doing his photo op with Mangione to actually say anything. Well, where's Gretchen Whitmer at to lecture the public about how there's consequences for behavior? When was the last time that you saw anything like this? Yeah, when Daniel Penny snuck up behind Jordan Neely and strangled him to death. This is the last time that we had a homeless person who was killed on a New York subway. So, is this the Daniel Penny effect? We need to go ahead and ask that question because things like what he did do not happen in a vacuum. The public sees it, especially the mendacious, sick, degenerate corners that he appeals to. So when they see him getting away with killing somebody, they start asking, well, why shouldn't the rest of us do it? Surely we can get away with it too. And not surprisingly, we see some of the same trash who defended that murder now acting indignant that people are drawing the same common sense connection between Daniel Penny killing a homeless person on the subway just for kicks with this latest act of someone who's done the exact same thing. They can't actually defend Daniel Penny, so they get angry when somebody reminds them of what he did. I told you about how around the time the white media was concealing Daniel Penny's identity and the politicians were praising and supporting him, in Brooklyn there was another case involving a black man, Jordan Williams. Unlike the killer Daniel Penny, Jordan Williams was physically attacked by his assailant. Not just someone who was acting bizarrely and he felt uncomfortable, but someone who attacked him and his girlfriend physically. And yet the authorities immediately arrested Mr. Williams. They charged him and tried to prosecute him. They did it because the public pressure forcing them to charge the killer Daniel Penny, well, they had to do something to retaliate. And this was their way of reestablishing the principle that if a white assailant kills a black man in cold blood and the public forces the authorities to actually apply the law to them, well, they gotta show that they can just snap a black man up and railroad him into a prison cell. Well, if you're going to have a white person who's going to be held to the law, well, we're going to have to show that we can have a black person thrown in prison just because. That's the actual standard. Black people are under the law. But if you're not black, then you're under white supremacy's rules, where there's all kinds of trapdoors and escape hatches to make sure that the law never actually touches you. And that was the principle that charging Mr. Williams was actually supposed to uphold. And you notice he didn't have any of the people who were supporting Daniel Penny supporting Jordan Williams. That was also part of it. About making sure everybody understands if a black person does it, see how different the reaction is. We want to make sure you understand, yeah, you can force us to actually put charges on somebody, but we're going to remind you that if you're black, there doesn't have to be any sort of public outcry in order for us to arrest you. Hell, there doesn't even have to be a crime. We do it just to send a message. That's what the horse and pony show trial of Mr. Williams was about. There was no case against him, and it collapsed in record time, but it shows how far these racists in New York City are willing to go to uphold their racial double standard. Next time some lobotomized moron tries to tell you how liberal New York is, and you got people on the right and the left who have been saying that, you remind them that liberal New York is the place that gave the world Bernie Goetz, a thug who with no provocation opened fire inside of a New York subway, intentionally shooting a group of black teenagers. He admitted that they never attacked him, but he claimed that he thought they wanted to rob him. even though no one put a finger on him, nobody pulled a gun or a knife, nobody threatened him. And then a white jury engaged in jury nullification and acquitted him for this attempted murder. And the white media, predictably, rather than condemn this gun-toting punk, instead they praised him. That was December 22nd, 1984, exactly 40 years ago. I wonder if any of this is sounding familiar yet. December 20th, 1986, almost exactly 38 years before today, 23-year-old Michael Griffith, a young black man in Queens, New York, was assaulted by a mob of white teenagers who targeted him and his two friends for their own sick idea of fun. They beat him to death with baseball bats. Where do they learn to be violently anti-black at? Where do they learn that kind of thing at? It's taught in the homes. So we're understanding what was being taught in some white homes in America since the 1960s. What they were teaching was the same thing they were doing before the 1960s. Now, predictably, the white media also downplayed this savage attack, and the Queens DA, he got on code with the white thugs, and he tried to give them low-ball charges. It was only due to public pressure that he got removed from the case, and a special prosecutor was called in who charged them more stringently, though not by a ton. And although they were convicted, the judge gave the murderers light sentences. Again, this in liberal New York, decades ago. April 19th, 1989, the Central Park Five were arrested and charged for a crime they didn't commit. But we all know the real crime was that a white person was assaulted, and the white authorities need to show black people who was in charge. Donald Trump infamously was lauded by Republicans and Democrats alike when he took out a full-page spread in the New York Times calling for the death penalty to be reinstated in response to this incident. Police and prosecutors used all kinds of dirty tricks and prosecutorial underhandedness to railroad those young men, but not one of the cops or the DAs who wrongly charged and prosecuted those kids has ever been punished for it. Even after the real assailant, Matthias Reyes, was captured and confessed to the crime, Linda Fairstein, the lead prosecutor on the case, and the cops involved still defend prosecuting those teenagers anyway. This after the real criminal was caught and confessed to the crime. So how is this liberal New York any different than the kind of racist arrests and prosecutions that you find in Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, or Alabama? The answer, it's not. And in 2006, you have the case of John White, a black man in Long Island. John White was protecting his family after his son was brutally beaten at a so-called party, and the assailants, in the middle of the night no less, came to Mr. White's home like some lynch mob, demanding that he send his son out. He told them to leave, and they didn't. The ringleader of this little gang was killed in the process of Mr. White protecting his family and his property. But John White wasn't called a hero by the white media or anyone else. He wasn't hailed as a vigilante. Nobody was talking about teenage gang violence needing to be stopped and how the public needs to take matters into their own hands because clearly the cops can't handle it and the families of these teenage thugs aren't raising their children right. Nobody doing any TV shows or movies about a black father protecting his family from a gang of white thugs who come to his home in the middle of the night. No one comparing John White to Death Wish either. No news pieces defending him. In fact, the white media stories about John White all read the same. Black man shoots white teen. That's it. Kind of seems like these headlines about this latest homeless killing in New York City, doesn't it? No castle doctrine for him, no talk about vigilantism, no talk about citizens being fed up with criminal youth gangs or roving bands of young punks attacking people and the law doing nothing, and so the citizens have to act. None of that. Not for him. Where was the NRA at to stick up for him? Same place they were when Philandro Castile was murdered. The headlines were all just black man kills white teen, as if he went to the guy's school and shot him in the middle of recess. Now understand that. Whenever somebody tries to claim that New York City or New York State is a Democrat state, they're just so blue, they're just so liberal up there. You make sure you remind them about all these cases. White supremacists lie, so it's your duty to make the bastards face the truth. So I want you to understand that this support for Luigi Mangione is not because they see him as some great hero. Had he been black, you can bet those same white people who are shrugging their shoulders about the rightness or wrongness of the killing of Brian Thompson, they would all be saying, well, I don't like my healthcare provider either, but this was murder. We can't have people just shooting executives in the street. I mean, what about the rule of law? These would be the same people online who are championing Luigi Mangione today. They would not be championing him if he was black. They would all be saying, well, no matter how he feels, no matter what happened to his loved ones, nothing justifies this. He needs to go through official channels. He needs to file a complaint with the state or something. They wouldn't say, well, the system's all on strings. He had no other choice. He was at the end of his rope. If Luigi Mangione was black, not a single one of his would-be supporters would be saying a word about paying for his legal defense, or that they wish they could be jurors so they could deny a guilty verdict. We all know this. The outrage is selective, and the only factor that determines how they react is the skin color of the parties involved. If it's a white person who kills, well, there's mitigating circumstances, extenuating circumstances. If it's a black person who kills, well, if they kill another black person, that's seen as an opportunity for the racists to do the black-on-black crime, those Negroes are just so violent line. Though at best, if it was a black person killing another black person, they would ignore it because no white people were involved. But on the other hand, as I've illustrated, if you have a case where a black person is accused of harming a white person, not one of them, not even your phony pretend white liberals on TV or the internet, will be taking his side. The only way to stop a black person from being railroaded into prison is to mount an aggressive and sustained public outcry. Without that, that black person is practically guaranteed to go straight from the courtroom to a prison cell with no stops in between. And these white liberals know it. So when a black person is accused, they'll fall silent at best, which means they're allowing the system to send that black person to prison, which everyone knows is the predictable, guaranteed result. Or, in many cases, these white liberals will suddenly discover their inner libertarian and begin telling you that nothing justifies violence. Now, at least. I'm sure that everybody has their own personal feelings and opinions about this incident and the social significance of it, or lack thereof. But for my part, Luigi Mangione does not have my admiration or contempt. I don't feel either way about the guy. We don't know if he's the actual killer or not, by the way, and truth be told, at this stage, it doesn't matter. The white media is determined to say that he is regardless, because he's in the center of a circus, but it's one where we aren't the ringleader. He's going to get his day in court, and even if everyone hated him, as we've seen with these cops who murder black people in the streets, he'll still be judged based on the law, and his legal arguments will be considered carefully. He comes from a well-to-do family, so he can certainly afford good lawyers. In fact, the white media describes him as coming from a family of wealth and privilege, so that means he can afford very good lawyers. But, assuming that he does indeed go to trial, no matter the outcome, the verdict will be respected, even by those who hate him, like these corporate executives. You won't see young white males or even Italian Americans in specific being singled out as dangers to society. Because if all these school shootings haven't caused the white media or the authorities to racially pathologize this kind of violence, then a CEO getting bumped off isn't going to do it either. Hell, Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked in his own home by a guy with a hammer and nearly killed, and that had no effect whatsoever, so white power is clearly determined to uphold its little old rules, which are more important to it than its own self-preservation. That's how you know white supremacy is going to go out of business. It's suicidal, because it can't stop itself. But we're not going to be seeing a raft of legislation aimed at stopping the next killer who comes from a family of wealth and privilege, just like we didn't see any legislation aimed at stopping the last one. And if this guy is acquitted, he'll be the subject of glowing interviews by the same white media that's been calling for him to be arrested and caught. And surely there'll be a crappy made-for-TV or streaming movie, certainly an episode of Law & Order, and maybe even a book deal if he plays his cards right. Legal scholars and social scientists alike will be tripping over themselves to explain how the adulation, and in this case a hypothetical acquittal, would be a strange socio-legal phenomena that deserves to be studied, but that the law is the law and we all just need to move on. And the matter will go no further than that. Something no one would be able to say for him if he was black. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Wally Belisle, Miss Debbie, Morris Bodden, Seven Semyon Ham, and Leonard Cottingham. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.